The wind that clawed across Kolyma's frozen valleys had a voice, thin, sharp, and merciless, like a blade dragged slowly over metal. It screeched through the forests of skeletal larches, rattled across the pale tundra, and scraped against the unfinished wooden barracks that dotted the wasteland. Men who heard that wind for the first time felt something inside them tighten. It was not merely cold, it was a warning, a promise, a threat whispered by nature itself that survival here was never guaranteed, not even for a single night. Those who came to Kolyma came unwillingly, prisoners, exiles, people plucked from their homes by the machinery of Stalin's state, shoveled into train cars and dumped into the kind of landscape that swallowed hope whole. But before all of that, before the camps grew like tumors across the land, there was a road. Or rather, the dream of a road. A line on a map that the Soviet leadership insisted must exist whether nature permitted it or not. This road would connect the port of Magadan to the remotest mines, stretching across a territory so cold that engine oil froze into tar and metal snapped like brittle twigs. To build such a thing required labor, endless, cheap, disposable labor. In other words, people who could die without consequence. That was how the story of Kolyma truly began, not with grand strategy or heroic exploration, but with an empire searching for bodies it could burn like firewood. The prisoners didn't know this when they first stepped off the ships that creaked into the harbor, ice crusting along their hulls like thick barnacles. They stood, blinking under the gray sky, breathing in air so cold it felt like acid in their lungs. The guards barked orders. Dogs snarled and pulled at their leashes. And on the distant horizon, a white ridge of mountains loomed like the jagged teeth of a sleeping beast. No one told the newcomers that they were staring at their future graves. If the prisoners had known that the very first thing they would build was their own burial ground, they might have laughed. Some did laugh, actually, short, broken bursts of disbelief when they learned what the task ahead truly demanded. They were told they would construct the Great Kolyma Highway, a ribbon of progress stretching into the endless wilderness. The prisoners understood soon enough that the highway was not meant for them. It was meant for trucks filled with gold. Kolyma was rich in minerals, and Stalin wanted every ounce of it, no matter the cost in human life. The road began with shovels. There were no machines powerful enough to fight the frozen soil, so men were handed picks that shattered in their hands and saws that buckled against the hard, icy earth. They worked in shifts that didn't feel like shifts at all. Just endless hours blurred together by exhaustion and cold. Their fingers split open. Their lips bled. Their breath froze into tiny crystals that hung in the air before falling like glittering dust. Those who slowed down were shouted at. Those who collapsed were kicked. Those who died were not carried away. The ground was too hard to dig graves in winter, so bodies were left beside the route, frozen into grotesque statues that watched over the living.
Over time, the living became fewer. The guards learned quickly that the easiest way to dispose of a corpse was also the most efficient way to reinforce the road. The layers of ice and gravel needed filler, something that would bind the surface together when the spring thaw turned the soil into a treacherous swamp. Corpses were perfect. They did not rot in the permafrost. They did not shift or swell. They remained exactly where they were placed, frozen in time and buried beneath the weight of Soviet ambition. Thus the moral equation was solved. The dead strengthened the road, and the living kept working to join them. One of the earliest prisoners to leave testimony about this period was a former teacher named Mikhail. He had been arrested for owning a foreign book, an absurd crime, yet one more than enough to earn him 10 years in the land of White Death. Years later, after he survived against all odds, he wrote that Kolyma had no seasons, only degrees of suffering. Summer was mud and mosquitoes so thick they formed black clouds. Winter was a silent monster that could stop a man's heart in minutes. Spring was hunger. Autumn was fear. But the road? The road was eternal. It demanded us, he wrote. It devoured us, and we fed it willingly, because refusal meant death. He recalled one morning when the guards brought the prisoners to a clearing where the forest had been stripped bare. The air was filled with the bitter smell of sap and sweat. The trees that had once offered shade had been cut down, their trunks laid end to end to form the base of the road. But the tree trunks alone were not enough. The land shifted too easily. The guards ordered the men to drag bodies from a cart. One by one, the frozen dead were hauled out like sacks of stone. Each thudded onto the ground with a sickening crack. Limbs shattered, ribs splintered. The wind howled across the clearing, carrying with it a sound that Mikhail would never forget. The brittle snapping of human bones as they were forced into a shape that would hold cars and trucks that none of the prisoners would ever ride. The day they buried the first 100 bodies beneath the road, the sky was clear. The sun shone weakly, casting long shadows across the snow. The prisoners were silent. Some whispered prayers. Others stared at the mountains. Everyone knew that the next body placed into the ground could be their own. The guards didn't care about such thoughts. They only cared about the quotas. Each kilometer of progress was reported back to Moscow with pride. The government celebrated Kolyma as a triumph of Soviet engineering, a victory over the natural world, a symbol of progress. They never mentioned what lay beneath the ice. They never described the faces of the men who froze where they fell. And they certainly never acknowledged that the road was built on a foundation of human suffering. As months passed, the camps expanded. Barracks sprouted like malignant growths along the route. More prisoners arrived. More bodies vanished beneath the gravel. The road stretched farther and farther into the wilderness, carving a scar across the land, a scar filled with secrets and bones. Many years later, when visitors traveled through Kolyma during the rare thaw of summer, they reported strange sights. Bones emerging from the melting mud, fragments of skulls peeking through the gravel, a tooth here, a femur there. The thaw always revealed what the cold tried to hide. The dead were restless. Their graves were shallow. The road did not merely cross the land, it held the land's ghosts like a terrible, frozen archive. But during the early stages of construction, when hope still flickered faintly in the hearts of new arrivals, some prisoners dared to believe that survival was possible. They whispered rumors of escape, of distant settlements, of a future beyond this icy hell. These whispers never lasted long. The cold smothered optimism. The guards crushed defiance, and the work crushed the human spirit. Yet even in the bleakest environments, humanity tries to survive in strange ways. Prisoners formed fragile friendships, sharing bits of stale bread or offering help when frostbite claimed fingers. They carved tiny symbols into tree trunks, left pebbles beside the bodies of those they respected, and told stories around meager fires. Stories of home, stories of summers that felt impossibly warm, stories of loved ones they might never see again. These stories were acts of rebellion, small sparks against an overwhelming darkness. In the early days of Kolyma, before the mines claimed as many lives as the cold, the road was the greatest devourer of men. It was a monument to cruelty constructed under the illusion of progress. Every meter demanded blood, every kilometer required sacrifice, and the prisoners understood that the road had no end, not really. It would stretch as long as there were bodies to feed it. When the first winter approached, the cold intensified until breath froze midair and skin cracked simply from exposure. The road became a death trap. Tools fused to fingers. Snow buried work sites overnight. Guards forced prisoners to keep digging even as storms blotted out the sky. Those who fell behind vanished beneath drifts taller than a man. Their comrades would find them days later, rigid as statues, their faces distorted in expressions of terror or resignation.
The guards marked these discoveries with a shrug. "Add him to the road," they would say, as if discussing a broken tool. And so the bodies were dragged back to the path, placed with disturbing precision, and covered in frost-stiffened earth. The road grew stronger. The prisoners grew weaker. Yet somehow, in the midst of this brutality, a kind of grim rhythm emerged. Wake up, work, freeze, sleep, repeat. Days lost their names. Time became an endless blur. But even as the prisoners' world collapsed into this bleak monotony, the land around them retained a strange, terrible beauty. The snow sparkled like crushed diamonds under the pale sun. The mountains stood silent and majestic. The forests whispered secrets that no man could fully understand. Kolyma was both breathtaking and deadly, a place where nature itself seemed complicit in the suffering of those who labored upon its frozen skin. As the road pushed deeper into the wilderness, the prisoners began to realize something unsettling. The landscape was swallowing them, not metaphorically, but literally. Their footprints vanished within minutes. Their shelters disappeared under fresh snow. The road they built stretched behind them like a graveyard spine, and the mines ahead promised only more darkness. And yet they marched on, because marching was the only option. Those early months laid the foundation for everything Kolyma would become. The terror, the cruelty, the unimaginable endurance. The Road of Bones was more than just a construction project. It was a symbol, a warning, a legacy carved into the earth with blood and frozen flesh. By the time winter loosened its grip the following year, the road had claimed thousands. Men had been transformed into statistics. Graves had become infrastructure. And the prisoners understood with terrible clarity that Kolyma was not simply a place, it was a verdict. And their sentence had only just begun.
Winter arrived in Kolyma like a silent army. No fanfare, no warning, just an abrupt shift in the air so sharp that even the most hardened guards paused mid-step, sensing the land tightening its grip. The sky dimmed to a dull silver, and the wind sharpened from a relentless annoyance into a weapon honed with icy precision. One morning the snow fell as a gentle veil, and by nightfall it was a suffocating force that swallowed entire work camps beneath its weight. In Kolyma, winter did not visit, it ruled. Prisoners who had survived their first weeks felt the change instantly. The cold seeped into their bones like a parasite, clinging to them long after they stepped indoors. Clothing stiffened, boots crackled with ice. Even breathing became an act of endurance, each inhale slicing the lungs with freezing air that felt more like broken glass than oxygen. Some men woke with frost on their eyelashes. Others woke numb from the shoulders down. But there were also those who did not wake at all. News of the dead did not travel through shouts or announcements. It moved with the quiet authority of routine. Guards would walk into the barracks before dawn, kicking the bottom bunk of each bed. If a man didn't flinch, didn't grunt, didn't even stir, his blanket was pulled back. The guards would stare at the body for a long moment, not out of compassion, but as if weighing whether the corpse could still be useful for labor before rigor mortis froze it stiff. Then they would call 2 other prisoners to drag the body outside. No ceremony, no goodbyes. Just a smear of frost where the head had lain, and then another name erased from the world. The cold in Kolyma was not a simple drop in temperature. It was an entire ecological system of cruelty. At minus 30 degrees Celsius, a breath might freeze your nostrils shut. At minus 40 degrees Celsius, exposed skin would blister and turn white within minutes. At minus 50 degrees Celsius and below, the cold became an invisible predator, capable of killing a man without leaving a single mark. Even steel bowed to it. Metal tools shattered, locks jammed permanently, engines stalled as though terrified of waking the beast that slept beneath the permafrost. The guards like to joke that Kolyma does half the killing for us. The prisoners rarely heard this joke without clenching their fists, not because the words were cruel. Cruelty had long since become commonplace, but because they were true.
In the beginning, the prisoners tried to fight the cold with instinctive tricks from their previous lives, huddling close together, wrapping rags around their hands, holding small stones heated in the fire pits. But nothing could combat the reality that the cold seeped through everything, even the ground they stood on. They learned quickly that warmth was temporary, but frostbite was permanent. One prisoner, a young man named Andrei, who had once worked as a baker, discovered this on a night when the temperature dropped to minus 55 degrees Celsius. He had been assigned to the night watch outside the barracks, 2 hours of standing in place, hands clasped around a rifle. After 15 minutes, he could no longer feel his fingers. At 40 minutes, he could no longer feel his arms. By the time his replacement shook him awake, Andrei's hands were frozen around the rifle like a grotesque sculpture. The guards had to pry them open, one cracked finger at a time. He survived, but both hands turned black within days. They amputated them with a hacksaw. No anesthesia, his screams swallowed by the infinite snow. This was Kolyma's lesson. Winter was not a season. It was an executioner. Everyday tasks became elaborate battles for survival. Fetching water from a frozen river required hacking through a thick sheet of ice with axes that often snapped on impact. Washing clothes was impossible. They froze into rigid slabs the moment moisture touched the air. Fires burned weak and low, struggling against winds that tore sparks away before they could catch. Even eating posed challenges. Soup froze in its bowl if prisoners didn't consume it quickly enough. Bread became so hard that men broke teeth trying to chew it. And amid all this, work continued. The mine shafts did not pause. The construction sites did not slow. The road of bones demanded more labor than ever in winter, because the frozen ground finally became solid enough to hold heavy loads. Prisoners swung pickaxes in temperatures that could freeze motor oil solid. Their breath crystallized instantly, settling on their clothes in a fine, glittering dust that made them look like specters, thin, hollow, and shimmering in the pale light of the Arctic sun. Some prisoners began to refer to Kolyma as the land where winter never ends. It wasn't entirely an exaggeration. Even in the brief summers, cold lingered in the shadows and seeped from the permafrost like a long-held breath. But winter was when Kolyma fully revealed herself, not as a place, but as a force. The guards, ironically, suffered too, though they hid it behind layers of insulating fur and thick coats that prisoners could only dream of. Their beards iced over, their boots cracked, their own morale withered under the constant assault of the cold. But unlike the prisoners, the guards had an advantage. They could retreat. They had heated cabins, warm food, and the knowledge that they had chosen this fate, or at least accepted it willingly.
The prisoners had no such luxury. Their barracks were drafty and underheated, their clothes thin and ragged. Each night, the men slept huddled like animals, pushing closer and closer in a desperate attempt to share body heat. Those who slept at the edges of the group were often the ones who didn't survive the night. By morning, the cluster of bodies would separate, and the frozen ones would be revealed. Men who had died quietly among the living. In the dead of winter, the landscape transformed into a white void. The horizon blurred beneath a constant fog of ice crystals suspended in the air. Sound behaved strangely. Footsteps echoed unnaturally. Voices seemed to come from far away. The wind carried whispers, tricks of the mind, perhaps, or the echoes of those who had frozen in storms long ago. Some prisoners swore they heard their own names on the wind. Others said they saw figures moving in the distance, silhouettes that vanished when approached. Hallucinations were common. Sleep deprivation, hunger, and cold combined into a torment that warped perception. A man might dig through the snow looking for imaginary bread. Another might wander off into the blizzard, convinced he saw his wife waving at him. These wanderers rarely returned. If they did, they came back frostbitten, delirious, and moments from death. The guards never searched for them. "If they walk away," one guard said, "the cold will retrieve them for us." The cold also reshaped alliances within the barracks. Men who had once hoarded scraps of food began sharing them with the weakest, knowing that a single death in the barracks meant a chill that would spread through the group like wildfire. Survival became a collective act, not of kindness, but of necessity. They understood that Kolyma's winter killed indiscriminately, strong and weak alike. The only strategy was unity. Yet unity had its limits. Starvation and fatigue could twist even the gentlest soul into something desperate. One night, a prisoner named Pavel stole a pair of wool stockings from another man while he slept. It was an act of pure self-preservation. But when the theft was discovered, the barracks fell into chaos. Fights broke out. Men screamed. Pavel was beaten until his face turned purple. The guards intervened only when they realized the disturbance was lowering morale and productivity. Pavel survived, but the next day on the worksite, he collapsed and died in the snow. No one knew whether it was from the beating, the cold, or simple exhaustion. Survival in Kolyma was never a matter of strength alone. It was a matter of luck, timing, and the fragile balance between the human body and an unforgiving climate. Those who lasted through their first winter were changed forever. They carried within them a knowledge that no book could convey, a knowledge of how close the human spirit could come to breaking without actually shattering.
But even survival had a cost. Many emerged from the winter with 1,000-yard stare, as if part of their soul had frozen and been left somewhere beneath the drifts. They no longer reacted to the cold. They moved like shadows, numb to everything except the rhythm of work and the promise of a thin bowl of soup at the end of the day. Their hearts beat, but their hope was gone. Those who arrived in spring often mistook this state for strength. They learned better by winter. As the seasons continued their brutal cycle, Kolyma's reputation spread among the prisoners. Men whispered that no place on earth was colder, not just in climate, but in spirit. Some said the land was cursed. Others believed it was the end of the world itself, a frozen purgatory where the dead and living mingled without distinction. Years later, survivors would recount the same truth in different words. In Kolyma, winter wasn't something you endured, it was something that lived inside you, long after you left. The cold never forgot. And in the months to come, the prisoners would discover that the true horrors of Kolyma had only begun to reveal themselves. The journey to Kolyma began long before the prisoners ever saw the jagged coastline or the bleak mountains that would soon devour their hope. It began in cramped cells across the Soviet Union, rooms so small a man could not fully stretch his legs, lit by a single flickering bulb, or at times by no light at all. There they waited, the accused and the condemned, the guilty and the innocent, all shivering together in a silence broken only by distant footsteps and the occasional hollow clang of a middle door. Rumors circulated long before the transfer orders arrived, whispers of a place so far removed from civilization that it might as well have been on another planet. Some heard the name Kolyma spoken in fearful tones, a name that carried an almost superstitious weight. Others had never heard of it and asked questions they would later regret. "What is Kolyma?" they would say, and those who knew simply stared at them with pity. When the guards finally marched them out of their holding cells, the prisoners realized just how little they understood about the fate awaiting them. They were marched in lines toward the infamous Stalin wagons, train cars built not for people but for livestock. The interior smelled of rust, mildew, and stale air trapped from previous transports. Wooden benches were bolted to the walls, and tiny barred slits served as windows. There was barely enough space for the men to sit, let alone lie down. The guards shoved them inside with the indifference of farmers herding cattle.
Then the doors slammed shut. Darkness swallowed them. The journey lasted days, weeks for some. The men lost track of time quickly. The train rattled endlessly along the tracks, rocking them into a half-conscious state where hunger, thirst, and exhaustion blurred together. At night, the temperature dropped so low frost formed on their breath, turning the air crystalline with each exhale. During the day, stale heat suffocated them. The wagon felt like a coffin that shifted between freezing and boiling, as if testing the limits of human endurance. Food was scarce, water scarcer. A single bucket was placed in the corner, the only sanitation offered. They lived pressed against one another, sharing body heat, but also sharing their fears. They spoke in hushed tones, exchanging half-remembered stories of people who had gone to Kolyma and never returned. Some clung to hope, insisting they had been mistaken for someone else. Others stared blankly ahead, their gaze suggesting they had accepted death long before the train reached the edge of Siberia. Occasionally, the train would pause, and the doors opened just long enough for guards to toss in a loaf of bread or drag out a collapsed body. The dead were left beside the tracks, their mouths open as though gasping for one final breath of the cold air. The train always resumed its journey without pause, as if impatient to deliver its cargo to the land that awaited it. Eventually, the prisoners reached the port city of Vladivostok, though city was too generous a word for what they saw. It was a bleak collection of barracks, warehouses, and loading docks. But to the prisoners, it felt like the edge of the world. Beyond this point, there were no more familiar landmarks, no more towns or villages, only the ocean.
and beyond the ocean, Kolyma. They were marched toward the ships at dawn. Fog clung to the harbor, swirling around their legs like a living thing. The ships themselves were hulking shadows, rust-eaten and grimy, with names that had long since lost their paint. Creaking metal groaned beneath their weight, as if protesting the human cargo forced upon them. The prisoners were herded into the lower decks, dark, damp chambers that smelled of salt, mold, and old suffering. Rats scurried along the beams above their heads, their scratching echoing through the hull like skeletal fingers tapping on wood. The men settled onto the hard floor, shoulders hunched, their breath forming pale clouds in the dim light. Guards slammed the hatch shut, locking them in darkness again.
The sea voyage was worse than the train. The waves tossed the ship violently, sending prisoners sliding across the floor in a tangled heap. Some vomited until nothing was left inside them but air. Others curled into corners, whispering prayers or weeping silently. Every creak of the hull felt like the ship might split in two and send them plunging into the freezing ocean. And yet, some found strange comfort in the sea. At least here, death was swift, merciful even. A man could slip overboard and vanish beneath the waves without leaving a trace. But the guards knew this too. They patrolled constantly, rifles ready, eyes hunting any sign of attempted escape. During the voyage, the prisoners were given almost no fresh water. Some drank melted ice scraped from the corners of the ship. Others licked condensation from rusty pipes. Disease spread quickly: fever, dysentery, infections that in any other place might have been treatable. Here they ran unchecked. The sick were pushed aside, left to die quietly. When their bodies grew cold, guards dragged them to the deck and rolled them into the sea. Several prisoners watched the bodies disappear beneath the gray waves, drifting briefly before sinking into the depths. No graves, no farewells. Just another reminder that they were no longer people, only burdens. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the ship approached the coast of Magadan. The prisoners felt the shift in the sea before they saw anything. Waves grew calmer, the wind changed, and a faint light began to seep through the cracks in the hull. The guards opened the hatch, and the prisoners blinked painfully as sunlight stabbed their eyes for the first time in weeks. What they saw was not a city. It was a wound carved into the coastline. Sparse wooden buildings stood scattered across a barren landscape of rock and snow. A single road stretched inland, leading toward mountains so immense they looked like the walls of a fortress built by nature to keep humanity away. The air was colder here, sharper, cleaner, but deadly in its clarity. Every breath felt like it could slice open their lungs. As they disembarked, a strange silence settled over the prisoners. This was it, the place they had heard whispered about in the cells, the name spoken only with dread. And now it stood before them, vast and empty, with an expressionless sky overhead and the scent of frost lingering in the air.
Magadan's docks were lined with guards wearing heavy winter coats, their rifles held with casual authority. But what caught the prisoners' attention were the other men watching from behind the fences. Emaciated, hollow-eyed, their skins stretched tightly over their bones, their faces expressionless, as if carved from ice. Some had frost-bitten ears or fingers. Others were missing entire limbs. These were not ghosts. They were the living remnants of earlier waves of prisoners, those who had survived long enough to be given lighter duties. They did not speak. They only stared. One newcomer, a former violinist named Leonid, whispered, "Are those the living?" His voice trembled. A prisoner who stood beside him, older and far too calm, replied, "Those are the lucky ones." The march inland began almost immediately. The prisoners moved in long, shuffling columns, escorted by guards and dogs. The cold bit deeper with each step. Snow crunched under their boots. Their breath formed white trails that followed them like reluctant ghosts. The mountains loomed closer, casting long, jagged shadows across the road. Eventually, they reached the camps. From a distance, the camps looked like clusters of wooden boxes scattered across the frozen ground. Tall fences enclosed them, topped with sharp wire that glinted in the pale light. Watchtowers stood at the corners, each one occupied by a guard wrapped in fur, rifle resting against the railing. Smoke drifted from chimneys, though not enough to suggest warmth inside. When the prisoners entered the gates, they were greeted by the sound of coughing, deep, hacking coughs that seemed to shake the very walls. The smell of unwashed bodies and damp wood filled the air. Inside the barracks, bunks were stacked 3 levels high, narrow and splintered. Thin blankets offered little protection from the cold. Frost coated the inner walls. The guards lined the newcomers up and began processing them. Names were recorded, then discarded. Numbers were assigned. Prisoners were told their sentences, though most knew these words meant nothing. 10 years, 20 years, life. The numbers blurred because everyone understood the truth. Kolyma had a different calendar than the rest of the world. Here, time was measured not in years, but in how many freezes a man could endure before the cold claimed him.
Clothes were stripped, hair shaved, belongings confiscated. One man, a merchant who had brought a tiny photograph of his daughter hidden in his boot, begged the guards to let him keep it. He was beaten so savagely that he spent his first week in the infirmary. The photograph burned in the stove that same night. Once processed, the prisoners were given their uniforms, thin canvas shirts, coarse trousers, and boots that barely held together. Some men stared at the uniforms as though holding their death sentences in their hands. Others put them on quietly, resigned to the fate ahead. The final step was the introduction to work. The camp commander, a broad-shouldered man with eyes as empty as the tundra, addressed them in a flat, unfeeling voice. "You are here to contribute to the growth of the Soviet state," he said. "Your labor is your purpose. Discipline will be enforced. Escape is impossible. Survival depends on obedience." The guards nodded approvingly. The prisoners stood silently, some trembling, others glaring defiantly, but no one spoke. That night, sleep did not come easily. The barracks were filled with strange noises. The groans of wood contracting in the cold, the rasping coughs of sick men, the distant howl of wolves wandering near the camp's edge. The new arrivals lay awake, staring at the ceiling, each lost in their own thoughts. For some, memories of home brought tears that froze on their cheeks. For others, the sheer shock of the journey had left them numb. But all of them, every single one, sensed something heavy pressing down on them, a feeling that the world that they had known was gone forever. And in its place stood Kolyma, a land so cold it stripped men of their pasts and carved their futures from ice. A land where the first step inside the gates felt like the last step away from humanity. A land that would soon teach them that suffering had depths they could never have imagined.
The first thing every prisoner learned in Kolyma was that gold, something they would never touch, never own, never even see, was the reason they had been dragged into this frozen wasteland. The second thing they learned was that gold in Kolyma did not glitter. It hid in veins beneath rock and permafrost, buried so deep and protected by such murderous cold that extracting it bordered on the impossible. But the Soviet state did not accept impossibilities. It accepted bodies. and Kolyma provided them in endless supply. Long before the prisoners arrived, Stalin had been obsessed with gold. The Soviet Union needed foreign currency, and gold was its surest path. The Politburo wanted numbers, tons of ore, ounces refined, mountains of yield, and when bureaucrats demanded more, the answer was always the same: send more prisoners. The human cost was irrelevant, because in the balance sheets of empires, suffering was cheaper than machines. The prisoners didn't know any of this when they first stepped into the mines. They had been told they were being sent to labor camps, but the reality was far worse. They were being fed to an industry, a monstrous machine fueled by hunger, fear, and human flesh. And like all machines built in haste and desperation, it devoured whatever it touched. Every morning before the sun rose, the guards would barge into the barracks, shouting orders that echoed through the cramped wooden rooms. Exhausted men scrambled to their feet. Their boots were stiff with frozen mud. Their joints cracked as they stretched limbs that had grown numb from the cold. Breakfast was a thin, watery soup with a scrap of black bread so hard it could have been used as a tool. Then came the march through the snow toward the mines. The walk itself was a punishment. The wind lashed at their faces, searing their skin with invisible knives. Frost coated their eyelashes. Their breath crystallized instantly, falling to the ground like shattered glass. But nothing, not the cold, not the hunger, prepared them for what awaited inside the mine shafts. The entrance to the mine was a dark mouth in the earth, surrounded by wooden supports that looked too thin to hold the surrounding cliffs at bay. Lanterns flickered along the walls, casting weak, trembling light that barely pushed back the darkness. The prisoners hesitated before entering, as if sensing the danger that lurked within. But hesitation was met with rifle butts, and soon they found themselves descending into a world where the cold above seemed merciful in comparison. Inside the mine, the temperature dropped sharply, yet sweat poured down their faces as they worked. The air was thick with dust, fine particles that turned their lungs into aching, wheezing machines. Wooden beams creaked ominously overhead. The floor was slick with melted ice, mud, and something darker that looked suspiciously like old blood. The tunnels were cramped, barely high enough for a man to stand upright. Many were forced to crouch as they swung their pickaxes. The rhythm of the mine was brutal. Strike, breathe, cough, repeat. The strikes echoed endlessly, a metallic heartbeat that filled the tunnels. Dust settled on their skin, mixing with sweat and forming a grimy paste. Their arms burned, their backs screamed, their breath came in ragged gasps as they inhaled more dust than air. Every strike seemed to take a piece of their strength, and every hour drained their will to live. In Kolyma, productivity was everything. Guards shouted quotas until their throats grew hoarse. Every prisoner was expected to fill a certain number of ore carts per day. Failure was treated as sabotage. Saboteurs were punished. Punishment could be extra shifts, beatings, or being left outside to freeze for hours. Sometimes it was a bullet. Sometimes it was simply being assigned the most dangerous parts of the mine, the unstable tunnels where cave-ins occurred with terrifying regularity. One prisoner, a former engineer named Oral, once told a new arrival, "If the gold doesn't kill you, the tunnels will." He was right. Cave-ins happened often, sudden collapses that buried men alive with barely a scream. The guards rarely attempted rescue. Too dangerous, they said. Too much effort. If they extracted the bodies at all, it was only because dead men still had work to contribute. They could be used to reinforce the road of bones. But as deadly as the cave-ins were, they were nothing compared to the avalanches above ground. When spring arrived, the thaw destabilized the snow-packed cliffs that surrounded the mining sites.
Walls of ice and snow, some dozens of meters high, would suddenly break free and roar down the mountainside. They moved with terrifying speed, obliterating everything in their path. Men were swept away like insects. Campsites were crushed. Tools and equipment vanished beneath tons of white death. The prisoners never heard the avalanche until it was too late. A faint rumble, then silence. Then the world exploded. The air filled with ice shards. The ground trembled. Entire work crews disappeared in seconds. Survivors were left digging frantically with their bare hands, clawing at the snow in hopes of reaching someone still alive.
"You don't dig for them," a guard once said with his shrug, when asked why rescue was never organized. "The mountain decides who lives, not us." The gold veins themselves were unpredictable. Some were so thin they barely qualified as profitable. Others ran deep, requiring prisoners to dig into the frozen earth with tools that shattered under pressure. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous the tunnels became. The earth groaned, rocks fell, water seeped through cracks, freezing instantly and trapping men beneath ice that could only be removed with fire. Fire the prisoners never had. Still, the demands for gold were relentless. Stalin wanted quotas met. Prisoners had to deliver. One day, a group of prisoners discovered a particularly rich vein, thick with shimmering ore embedded in black rock. The guards erupted in celebration. They shouted, laughed, and even fired rifles into the air. The prisoners, however, knew what this meant. They would be worked harder than ever. And they were right. For days they worked without rest. Food rations were cut, breaks eliminated. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Some died mid-swing, their bodies slumping forward as their pickaxes slipped from their hands. One night, while resting in the barracks, a prisoner named Ivan whispered to the others, "Gold must be cursed. Why else would it demand so much blood?" No one responded, but many nodded. They had begun to feel it too, the sense that the earth itself was hungry, that the gold veins were veins of a living creature, and each strike opened wounds that demanded payment. And payment always came. Prison guards and administrators justified the cruelty with cold, bureaucratic logic. "Hard labor builds strong character," they said. "The state provides purpose to those who lack it." But the prisoners knew the truth. They were expendable. Their lives were collateral. Their suffering was a resource to be extracted along with the gold. Sometimes guards would mock the men by holding up nuggets they found. "This is worth more than your life," they'd say, tossing the gold into a sack while the prisoners watched with empty eyes. The disease worsened everything. Pneumonia swept through the mines like a storm. Men coughed until blood splattered the walls. The infirmary, if it could be called that, was nothing more than a shack with a few beds and no real medicine. Those who entered rarely came out. Their bodies were tossed into pits outside the camp or used to reinforce the road.
The mine foremen were unrelenting. One overseer, known as the Wolf for his habit of wearing a fur hat even indoors, believed fear increased productivity. He carried a whip made from braided leather and wire. When prisoners slowed, he lashed them. When they collapsed, he lashed them harder. He didn't do it out of cruelty, though that was certainly present, but out of obsession. He wanted to impress his superiors, to earn medals and promotions. His pride was built on corpses. Over time, the prisoners understood something profound. The mine was not just a workplace, it was a battlefield. The enemy was not just the guards or the cold, it was the earth itself. And yet, despite everything, some prisoners clung to life with a stubbornness that defied logic. They learned to read the tunnels, to sense when a collapse was coming, to spot weaknesses in the supports. They shared scraps of food. They whispered warnings. They created tiny pockets of hope in a world designed to extinguish it.
But no amount of hope could change the truth. The gold demanded blood, and Kolyma delivered. Each day ended the same way. Men stumbling back to the barracks, covered in dust and sweat, their faces gaunt and hollow. They crawled onto their bunks exhausted beyond words. Some prayed, some cried silently. Others simply closed their eyes and tried not to think about the next day. Because in Kolyma, tomorrow meant only one thing: more digging, more suffering, more death. And somewhere deep beneath the ice, the gold waited, patient and indifferent, for more men to bleed for it. The morning bell in Kolyma was not a bell at all. It was a length of rusted metal struck with a hammer until the cold air vibrated with a harsh, metallic shriek. It cut through sleep like a blade. It was the sound that separated dreams, if prisoners still dreamed, from the grim machinery of their waking existence. When the bell screamed, bodies jolted upright, not out of discipline, but out of reflex. Life depended on it.
In Kolyma, nothing began gently. Men did not wake slowly, did not stretch, did not yawn. They snapped awake like hunted animals, because hesitation meant punishment. A guard would storm into the barracks, snow still clinging to his coat, and shout numbers, not names. Names had disappeared on day one, stripped along with their clothes and dignity. Numbers were easier for the guards, less human, easier to forget when a man collapsed on the worksite and was replaced by another. The prisoners lined up outside the barracks as the sky began to pale. The sun rarely revealed itself fully in Kolyma, and when it did, it offered no warmth. The wind howled across the frozen ground, swirling flecks of ice like shards of broken glass. Men stamped their feet to keep circulation flowing, but many couldn't feel their toes at all. Frostbite was a slow thief. It began with numbness, then whitened the skin, then turned it black. Then the body parts simply died. Roll call began. The guards walked down the rows, barking numbers that echoed like commands from a distant battlefield. Prisoners raised their hands or stepped forward when their numbers were called. If someone didn't move quickly enough, a rifle butt slammed into their ribs. If someone fell over during roll call, they were dragged aside like a broken tool. Roll call lasted too long. It always did. It was not about counting. It was about breaking the spirit. After roll call came the march to work. The prisoners stumbled forward in long lines, breath crystallizing around their faces until they looked like ghosts drifting toward their own graves. Some coughed violently, their lungs ravaged by dust and cold. Others limped, their joints stiff from malnutrition. Every man carried a pain of some kind. In Kolyma, pain was the only thing that felt truly alive. The walk to the work site was silent. Words took energy. Words were dangerous. The only sounds were boots crunching snow and wind screaming across the barren land. Sometimes wolves followed from a distance, thin, starving creatures drawn by the scent of weakening men. In Kolyma, predators did not fear humans. They waited for them. Breakfast had been a thin soup, more water than food, and a piece of bread as dense as stone. The bread was so small it could disappear in a single bite, yet prisoners learned to make it last, tearing it into fragments and savoring each one as if it were a feast. Hunger reshaped their minds, their bodies, their sense of time. Every day was measured in crumbs. Every hour was defined by the space between meals. The stomach was a constant roar, a second heartbeat.
Work assignments varied. Some went to the mines, others to construction, still others to road building. The worst assignments rotated depending on who had angered which guard the previous day. But no matter the task, the routine was always the same. 16 to 18 hours of brutal labor, broken only by a brief midday pause. At the worksite, men were ordered to grab their tools, pickaxes, shovels, hammers, old, splintered things that looked like they had dug graves for centuries. The guards handed them out casually, as if tools and men were equally easy to replace. Then the actual suffering began. In the mines, prisoners swung pickaxes until their shoulders burned with agony. The air was so thick with dust that men coughed blood after only a few hours. Temperature changes made the tunnels crack and groan. The deeper the prisoners dug, the more the earth felt alive, restless, resentful. Rocks fell without warning. Entire shafts collapsed. Every time a man entered, he wondered if he would ever see the sky again. On the road of bones, prisoners hacked through frozen soil that resisted every strike. Their breath wheezed through chapped lips. Some wore rags instead of gloves. Blood froze instantly on the fabric. When a man cried out from pain, the guards shouted him to work faster. Tears froze on cheeks. In construction zones, they carried lumber so heavy it bowed their spines. They lifted steel supports that burned or froze skin, depending on the weather. They climbed scaffolds in winds strong enough to tear a man off the platform. If someone fell, the guards didn't rush to help. They only recorded the number and moved on. Punishments were constant. A dropped tool earned a beating. A slow worker earned two. A man caught resting earned hours of torture. Guards had favorite methods. Some used whips, others preferred exposure, forcing men to stand shirtless in the snow until their skin cracked and peeled. The worst guards liked to make prisoners kneel on ice for hours, their bodies trembling uncontrollably, each minute carving deeper into muscle and bone. The idea was simple: obedience through exhaustion. A broken man did not rebel. But some prisoners found small ways to resist. Not open rebellion, no one survived that, but tiny acts of defiance. A stolen moment of rest, a whispered joke, a hidden scrap of bread offered to a starving friend. These gestures were quiet victories, reminders that humanity had not been entirely extinguished.
Still, the system worked as designed. Men became numbers. Numbers became statistics. Statistics became progress reports. And progress reports pleased Moscow. At midday, the work paused, not for rest was forbidden, but for another bowl of watery stew. The food tasted of nothing. It had no spices, no warmth, no life. Still, men slurped it greedily, afraid the wind would freeze it solid before they finished. After lunch, their bodies stiffened from the brief pause. Restarting the labor felt like being dragged from a grave. Muscles screamed, eyes burned, fingers barely obeyed commands. But the work continued, because in Kolyma, willpower didn't matter. Fear did. The afternoon dragged like a nightmare. The sky dimmed early. Shadows stretched long and thin across the icy ground. Guards paced with rifles in hand. Dogs barked restlessly, their breath visible in the frigid air. The cold intensified. The prisoners worked faster just to generate heat. When the final horn sounded, announcing the end of the shift, some men collapsed on the spot. They were carried by their comrades or kicked by guards until they rose. No one was allowed to die outside the barracks unless the guards had planned it. The walk back was worse than the walk to the site. The cold felt colder, the hunger sharper. The men's faces hollowed into skull-like masks. Some muttered to themselves, some stared straight ahead, lost in a fog of delirium. A few cried silently, their tears turning to frost. Back at the camp, dinner was identical to breakfast, a bowl of near-boiling water with a few floating crumbs. Some prisoners couldn't even bring the spoon to their mouths. Their hands trembled too violently.
Others devoured the soup as if it were the last thing they would ever eat. For some, it was. After dinner came inspections. Guards walked through the barracks, checking for contraband, mostly extra food, sometimes stolen tools. They turned out beds, ripped open blankets, searched pockets with rough, impatient hands. If they found anything, the owner was dragged outside. Sometimes, hours later, the barracks would hear a single gunshot. Other times, they heard screams. When the lights finally dimmed, the prisoners crawled onto their bunks, their bodies aching from head to toe. They huddled together for warmth because the barracks were barely heated. Some whispered prayers, others whispered memories. A few whispered nothing at all. They had already been emptied out by Kolyma.
He punished for entertainment. He tormented for curiosity. He killed because it made him feel powerful. Prisoners said he treated the camp like his personal playground. If a man stumbled in the snow, Malenkov would force him to crawl while he rode on his back like a child on a horse. If someone coughed too loudly, he beat them for disturbing his peace. If a prisoner dared to look at him without lowering his gaze, Malenkov smiled, a wide, unsettling smile, and whispered, "Good. You have spirit. I can break that." He once forced 2 prisoners to fight each other in the snow, promising the winner extra bread. When one man collapsed, coughing and bleeding, Malenkov shot him in the head and shrugged. He lost anyway. No one ever asked what happened to the bread. Among the prisoners, stories circulated about other guards, lesser monsters with their own methods of cruelty. There was Lieutenant Koral, who believed cold was the purest form of punishment and routinely ordered men to strip and stand in the snow until they fainted. There was Sidorov, whose punishments were always silent and always personal. There was Petrov, who took pleasure in reporting even the smallest infractions, as if gathering souls for his own private collection. But the worst of all, the ones prisoners feared most, were the Urkas, the criminal elite. These were not guards. They were inmates, but they had privileges, power, and influence. The Soviet system believed that violent criminals could be used to keep political prisoners in line, and so the camp handed them authority they used with savage delight. The Urkas controlled the barracks, decided who slept where, who got scraps of food, who lived, and who suffered. They stole from the weak. They beat anyone who crossed them. They worked alongside the guards, becoming the unofficial enforcers of Kolyma. Prisoners feared them in a different way than the guards. Guards killed quickly. The Urkas killed slowly. One Urka in particular, known only as Shark, became a legend of brutality. He had teeth missing from old fights, a twisted nose, and arms covered with tattoos from years in underground prisons. Shark did not need weapons. His hands alone were enough. He could strangle a man in seconds. He could break bones with ease. And because the guards trusted him to maintain order, he operated with near total impunity.
He walked through the barracks each night, a shadow among shadows. Men held their breath when he passed. No one looked directly at him. To gain his attention was to invite misery. His favorite pastime was stealing blankets from the weakest prisoners and watching them freeze. "Nature chooses the strong," he often said. "I just help it along." But even monsters had rules. The guards and the Urkas coexisted because they served the same goal: control. And control was everything. Yet, for all their cruelty, the guards had weaknesses, small cracks in their armor that prisoners learned to exploit. Kirchhoff hated lateness, and obsession with punctuality bordered on ritual. Biryuk despised singing and became violently enraged if he heard prisoners humming.
Malenkov was terrified of wolves, even as he hunted men like prey. Shark, despite his brutality, was strangely afraid of fire. These cracks, tiny, almost invisible, became tools for the desperate. The prisoners used them to survive. They whispered warnings. They avoided certain pathways. They stayed silent around Biryuk. They never sang within earshot of him. They learned which guards could be bribed with information, which could be distracted, which could be manipulated. In a place where death was constant, knowledge was power. But even knowledge was not enough when the masters of cruelty decided to make an example of someone. Punishments were public, deliberate, designed to instill terror. Once, the guards caught a man stealing a scrap of bread. They dragged him to the center of the courtyard, forced every prisoner to gather, and locked him inside a wooden box barely large enough for a child. Then they left him there for 2 days. When they opened the box, the man was alive but broken, his mind shattered by confinement and cold. Another time, a prisoner attempted to escape. He made it as far as the tree line before collapsing. The wolves reached him before the guards did. When the guards found his remains, they dragged them back and displayed them at the gate as a warning. The message was always the same. There is no mercy here. There is no freedom. There is no salvation. Every prisoner eventually realized that the guards were not just enforcing rules. They were shaping a world where fear was the only law. A world where cruelty was currency. A world where hope was dangerous.
And yet, despite the iron fist that ruled Kolyma, something strange persisted in the prisoners' hearts, a fragile, stubborn defiance that no amount of cruelty could fully erase. They hated the guards, but they also pitied them, because deep down, they knew the truth. A man who inflicts suffering becomes enslaved to it. The guards were trapped in Kolyma too, trapped in roles that twisted them into monsters. Some drank themselves numb each night. Others stared at the horizon as if longing for a different life. A few, rarely, silently, handed a prisoner an extra scrap of bread, or looked away when someone stumbled during roll call. But mercy was dangerous, for both sides. So it remained hidden. In the end, the guards were not gods. They were not devils. They were men. Men who had surrendered humanity in exchange for power. And in Kolyma, that power meant one thing: the right to decide who lived and who died. The prisoners understood this with terrible clarity, and they also understood that the time was coming when even the masters of cruelty would face forces far greater than themselves. For in Kolyma, no man, not even the cruelest, could outrun the cold forever. There were days in Kolyma that began with silence, brief, eerie moments when the wind paused, the camp dogs stopped barking, and even the guards seemed to hold their breath. But these moments were deceiving. They were not peaceful. They were the inhale before a scream. Because in Kolyma, every day unfolded like a ritual of suffering, a ceremony of endurance designed not to test the limits of men, but to break them entirely. A typical day began long before dawn ever considered touching the horizon. Darkness clung to the barracks like a suffocating shroud. The air inside was thick with the smell of sweat, frost, damp wood, and sickness. Dozens of men lay crammed together on bunks built too close to the ground and too narrow to ever allow real sleep. Their breath rose in pale plumes that curled along the ceiling beams, freezing into tiny crystals that sparkled weakly in the gloom.
Then the metal bell sounded. It was not a bell at all, only a rusted beam struck with a hammer. But in the stillness of the early hours, it was loud enough to jolt the soul. It screamed through the darkness, vibrating through frozen air, tearing men from whatever shallow rest they managed to cling to. The sound meant only one thing. Hell had begun again. A guard kicked open the door, allowing a blast of icy wind to rush inside. It swept over the sleepers like a living creature, biting exposed skin, freezing breath mid-air. The guard barked numbers, not names, his voice sharp enough to slice through the fog of exhaustion. Prisoners groaned and sat up. Bones cracked, muscles throbbed. Some needed help standing. Others trembled uncontrollably as they groped for their threadbare coats. 2 men did not rise. They were frozen, quiet, stiff, their eyes half open as if still waiting for morning. The guards dragged their bodies out without ceremony, leaving behind icy impressions on the bunks. Roll call started in the courtyard, where darkness still swallowed everything. Floodlights flickered weakly through the swirling snow, casting long, distorted shadows across the rows of shivering figures. The wind howled, carrying with it grains of ice that stung exposed skin. Prisoners stood shoulder to shoulder, trying to share warmth, though warmth was a distant fantasy in Kolyma. The guards paced slowly in front of them, rifles slung over their shoulders. Malenkov strolled near the front, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He kicked at the snow like a bored child. Biryuk scanned the faces with predatory sharpness. Commander Kurganov observed in silence, as always, his expression unreadable. The count began. It lasted far too long, by design. The cold was a tool, and the guards wielded it with precision. Prisoners shifted from foot to foot, trying to keep their blood moving. Their lungs ached from the cold. Their fingers felt like brittle twigs. When a man collapsed during the count, the guards didn't pause. They simply stepped over him. After roll call came the march. The prisoners trudged toward the mines in a long line that snaked across the frozen landscape. Snow crunched beneath their boots. The wind whipped across the valley, dragging icy breath from the mountains. Some men coughed so violently they bent double. Others walked with blank expressions, their eyes distant, their thoughts drifting somewhere far away, toward warm kitchens, toward families, toward memories that now felt like hallucinations. At the worksite, the guards ordered everyone to collect tools, pickaxes, shovels, rusted wheelbarrows. Everything was cold enough to burn skin. Prisoners who grabbed tools too quickly let out stifled cries as the frozen metal bit into their palms. Guards laughed and ordered them to keep moving. And so another day of labor began. Inside the mine shafts, darkness pressed down like a weight. Lanterns flickered along the walls, their light barely illuminating the narrow tunnels. The air tasted of dust, thick, choking dust that clung to throats and filled lungs with grit. The ground trembled with each pickaxe strike. The wooden beams overhead groaned ominously. The men worked in synchronized misery. Swing, breathe, cough, swing again. Hours passed unnoticed. Time dissolved into rhythm, pain, and exhaustion. The only markers were the sudden shouts of guards or the sharp crack of a whip slicing through the air. Sometimes a rockfall interrupted the monotony. Someone shouted a warning, but it was never soon enough. A crash, a scream, dust exploding through the tunnel. Then silence. The work never stopped, not for death, not for fear. At midday, prisoners were led outside for a meal, a tin cup of watery soup that was mostly melted snow. The men formed a line, their breaths drifting upward like white smoke. Some stared longingly at the soup as if it were treasure.
Others glanced around nervously, waiting for a chance to steal food or for someone to steal from them. Hunger reshaped morality. It stripped away layers of decency until survival was the only language spoken. Those too weak to hold their cup spilled their meal onto the ground. No one offered help. A mistake like that was a small death sentence. Then came the second half of the day, the true test of endurance. The cold deepened. The sun, pale and weak, hovered behind a veil of cloud, offering no comfort. The wind intensified, forcing prisoners to lean into its force just to walk. In the mines, lanterns sputtered, and shadows danced unnervingly on the walls. Men stumbled. Tools slipped from frozen hands. The guards grew impatient, and the punishment began. Biryuk prowled the tunnels, snapping his whip at anyone who slowed even slightly. Malenkov forced a group of exhausted workers to move rocks twice their weight, laughing as they struggled. Kurganov observed in silence, making notes on a clipboard, his expression unreadable. The hours dragged on. Some men collapsed outright, dropping their tools and falling to their knees. A few forced themselves back up, trembling with effort. Others couldn't rise. The guards dragged them outside, for air, they claimed. Everyone knew what that meant. Exposure. The cold would finish what the labor had started. Near evening, avalanches in the mountains began rumbling. The tremors shook the ground beneath the prisoners' feet. Snow cascaded down distant cliffs like white waterfalls. The guards kept the men working, pretending not to notice the danger.
The day finally ended only when darkness returned, swallowing the landscape whole. The prisoners, exhausted beyond words, marched back toward the barracks. Some whispered prayers. Others whispered curses. Many said nothing at all. Their bodies felt heavy, their limbs numb. Snowflakes clung to their eyelashes. Frost grew in their beards. A few men stumbled and needed to be half-carried by their comrades. Returning to camp was supposed to be a relief. It never was. Inside the barracks, the air was stale and frigid. The stoves struggled to stay lit. Men crowded around them, desperate for warmth. Some wept silently as the heat returned sensation to their fingers, painful, burning sensation. Others removed their boots and stared at blackened toes, knowing infection would soon set in. Dinner was served, the same thin soup, the same crust of bread, the same bitter taste of survival. Afterward, guards performed searches. They rifled through bedding, yelled insults, shoved men aside. They looked for stolen food, hidden tools, forbidden notes. Most nights, someone was dragged outside. After searches came the long, miserable stretch of night. Men lay on their bunks, their bodies twisted in pain. Some moaned with fever. Others clutched their chests, trying to ease the ache of lungs filled with dust. A few muttered in their sleep, calling out the names of loved ones. The barracks creaked in the wind. Snow drifted through cracks in the walls. The cold seeped into marrow. Outside, wolves howled. A man whispered to his bunkmate, barely audible, "Do you think tomorrow will be better?" His bunkmate didn't answer, not because he lacked the strength, but because there was no point in answering. In Kolyma, tomorrow was never better. Tomorrow was a repetition, a cycle, a sentence. The bell would scream, the guards would march, the mines would swallow men whole. And each day, Kolyma herself waited, silent, ancient, vast, knowing that she needed only time to claim every life sent to her. A day in hell was not an ordeal. It was a routine. And the worst truth of all was that the prisoners accepted it, not willingly, but because the mind, when battered enough, learns to survive by surrendering everything that once made it human. In Kolyma, strength was not measured by muscle or speed or even the ability to endure pain. Those things disappeared quickly, stripped away by starvation, labor, and cold. True strength, the kind that mattered, lived inside the mind. It was stubborn, irrational, and impossibly small, like a flicker of light in a cave so deep that even shadows feared entering. Most prisoners lost that light early. They had it beaten out of them, starved out of them, frozen out of them. But some, somehow, kept it burning. These were the ones who refused to break. They were not always the strongest or the bravest. They were not heroes, not in any storybook sense. But they possessed something the camp could not crush, a refusal to let Kolyma define the entirety of their existence. Every barracks had at least one of them, a man whose shoulders were not yet completely bowed, a man who still whispered encouragement to others, a man who, despite having no reason left to hope, held on to it stubbornly, even foolishly. One of these men was Leonid, the violinist. Before his arrest, Leonid had performed in grand concert halls, standing beneath chandeliers that glittered like stars. His hands once danced across strings with a grace that could silence entire rooms. When he arrived in Kolyma, those same hands shook from hunger and cold. His fingers bled daily, the skin splitting from frostbite. Yet in the darkest hours of night, when the barracks were filled with groans and coughing, Leonid would lift his trembling hands into the air and move them, as if playing an invisible violin. The notes he imagined were soft, silent, but the prisoners saw his fingers move, saw the faint smile ghost across his cracked lips, and somehow they heard music. One night, as snow battered the barracks and the wind rattled the walls, a man whispered, "What are you playing?" Leonid didn't open his eyes. Something warm. The prisoners swallowed their grief and watched him, and for the first time in days, some of them slept without nightmares. Leonid survived longer than anyone expected, not because he was strong, but because he refused to surrender the part of himself that made him human. His music, though silent, kept him alive long after others believed he should have collapsed. Another was Mikhail, a Georgian farmer who had lost everything, his land, his home, his family. When he arrived in Kolyma, he had the build of a man who had tilled fields all his life, broad shoulders, thick hands, a spine that seemed carved from determination. But strength alone did not keep him whole. What set Mikhail apart was the way he treated every prisoner, including the Urkas, as if they were still men, not broken things.
He shared food, scraps mostly, but valuable scraps. He helped men stand when they fell during roll call. If someone collapsed on the work site, Mikhail was always the first to lift them, even if doing so earned him a beating. He never raised his voice, he never cursed, he never asked for anything in return. Some believed he was a fool, others believed he was a saint, but Mikhail never claimed either. He only said one thing, over and over, like a mantra. If I lose myself, then Kolyma has already killed me. It was not bravery. It was self-preservation of the soul. Then there was the professor, though no one remembered his real name. He had once been a historian, a man who carried entire centuries inside his head. The guards tried to crush him early, assigning him to the most brutal tasks. They believed he would die quickly. Intellectuals usually did. But the professor had something rare, an ability to turn his mind into shelter. In the mines, while swinging a pickaxe, he recited stories silently, stories of ancient wars, lost civilizations, forgotten kings. At night, he whispered tales to the others, recounting epics with the precision of a scholar and the tenderness of a father soothing a frightened child. One night, a young prisoner named Alexei cried quietly, mourning the mother he would never see again. The professor climbed down from his bunk and sat beside him. "Do you know why stories survive?" he asked. Alexei shook his head. "Because someone refused to let them die. And so long as we tell them, they remain alive. As long as you remember your mother, she lives here," he touched his chest, "and no guard can take that." Alexei did not stop crying, but his tears changed, became softer, less desperate, and he slept. The professor kept others alive through memory. He gave meaning to days that otherwise blurred into a cold, gray void. But the prisoners who refused to break did not all look like saints or scholars. Some were men who endured through sheer stubbornness. Like Keir, the mechanic. Keir swore constantly, chain-smoked when he could steal tobacco, and argued with anyone within reach. His temper was legendary. His scars were maps of fights he had survived. But beneath that fire was something precious. Defiance. He did not bow his head, even when beaten. He did not let the guards silence him entirely. When others whispered that they would die in Kolyma, Keir growled, "Not me. Hell will freeze before I do." Ironically, in Kolyma, that was almost possible. One night, after a particularly brutal shift, Keir returned to the barracks with frostbitten hands, swollen and purple. He laughed, a hoarse, painful sound that made the others stare. "Even the cold wants to kill me," he said, "but it will have to wait in line."
His crude humor, his stubborn anger, his refusal to surrender dignity, these things kept men from drifting into despair. Keir was not gentle. He was not patient, but he was alive, boldly, furiously alive, and in Kolyma, that made him extraordinary. Yet the ones who truly refused to break were not always visible. Some were quiet men, men who did not speak unless spoken to, who did not stand out in any way. But inside them lived a resolve the guards could not measure. One was Pavel, who carried a small pebble in his pocket, a smooth, round stone he had picked up on the ship to Magadan. It reminded him of his daughter, who used to collect pebbles by the river near their home. He held it during roll call. He held it during forced marches. He held it when he slept. It was just a stone. But it was also everything he had left of a life that felt impossibly far away. That pebble kept him grounded, kept him human. Another was Yasmin, a Tartar poet who rarely spoke. She wrote poems in her head because writing materials were forbidden. She carved verses silently into the frost on her bunk, watching them melt into the wood. Every night she created new ones. They lived only for minutes before disappearing. But that was enough. In a world obsessed with erasing identity, Yasmin created herself anew each night. What united these survivors was not physical strength. It was not knowledge or skill or luck. It was something more elusive, a decision made deep within their hearts. Kolyma would not have all of them. It could take their bodies. It could take their years. It could take their breath. But it would not consume their souls entirely. They survived in different ways. Leonid survived through music. Mikhail survived through kindness. The professor survived through memory. Keir survived through defiance. Pavel survived through love. And Yasmin survived through creation. And their survival had a strange, dangerous side effect. It inspired others. Even the smallest act, an extra scrap of bread, a whispered story, a shared joke, could ignite hope in a place where hope was meant to die. Of course, not all of these men and women lived long enough to see the camp crumble years later. Many died, some suddenly, some slowly. But they died themselves, as themselves, not as broken things. And those who survived carried something powerful with them. The proof that even in the coldest, cruelest place on earth, the human spirit could burn hotter than frost. These were the ones Kolyma could wound, starve, freeze, and brutalize. From the moment prisoners first stepped under the frozen soil of Kolyma, they knew escape was impossible. The guards said it openly, gleefully even. The Urkas laughed at the idea. The older prisoners warned the new ones in hushed whispers. Escape here is not freedom, it is suicide. But human beings are strange creatures. Even in the darkest places, even when reason is ground into dust, the desire for freedom flickers like an ember buried beneath ash. Some men bury that ember to survive. Others fan it desperately, and a few, just a few, let it consume them entirely. These were the escape seekers. They studied the guards, memorized their routines, watched for the slightest crack in the camp's constant vigilance. They counted the seconds between patrols. They mapped the shadows. They tracked the direction of the wind and the angle of the moon. They weighed scraps of bread, imagining how far it could carry them. They noticed which dogs were lazier, which fences were older, which nights were colder. But no matter how meticulous their planning, they always encountered the same immovable reality. There was nowhere to go. Kolyma was a frozen island of land and death. The nearest village lay hundreds of kilometers away, across terrain so savage that even wolves avoided it. Mountains rose like walls of jagged teeth. Rivers froze into glass-hard arteries. Forests stretched endlessly, their trees whispering secrets of lost wanderers whose bones were still trapped beneath the snow. Even so, some tried. The first story whispered among prisoners was about a man named Timofey, a former soldier with a scar across his jaw and eyes that burned with stubborn fire. He had arrived in Kolyma believing himself unbreakable. The guards didn't scare him, the cold didn't intimidate him, the work didn't break him. He believed he had survived worse. He believed he knew how to disappear into wilderness. But Kolyma was not wilderness. It was a living force. One night during a blizzard, Timothy slipped out from the barracks during a brief distraction. He had spent months preparing, stealing scraps of food, stitching together cloth for extra warmth, and counting guard rotations. He made it past the first fence by crawling beneath a loose section of wire. He made it into the tree line. He vanished into the white.
He lasted 6 hours. They found him the next day, barely a kilometer away. The cold had claimed him silently, mid-step, his body frozen upright like a statue reaching toward nothing. His hands were crusted in frost. His face was twisted in a grimace of disbelief, as if even in death he couldn't accept that the cold had beaten him so easily. The guards dragged him back by his boots, his head bouncing against the snow. They displayed him in the courtyard for a full day before tossing him into an unmarked pit. The message was clear. The cold is our most loyal guard. But some escape attempts were more elaborate, daring enough to inspire whispers of admiration, even as they ended in tragedy. There was the story of the 3 shadows, Victor, Sandor, and Yuri. They were friends forged in suffering, each possessing a different strength. Victor had keen eyes, Sandor had a strategic mind, and Yuri had endless endurance. Together, they believed they could do what no one else had. They chose to escape during the short summer, when the snow melted just enough to reveal rocky ground and rivers began to flow.
The conditions were still lethal, but survivable for a time. Their plan was simple on paper. Steal tools from the workshop, cut through the perimeter fence, follow a river into the mountains, cross through the valley, and make their way south toward the coast. The night they escaped, the moon was hidden behind clouds. Rain fell lightly, masking their movements. They cut through the fence slowly, careful not to let the metal sing. Then they ran, quiet, fast, hearts pounding. By dawn, they had covered several kilometers. They hid beneath a fallen tree, catching their breath. For the first time in months, Victor whispered, "We're going to make it." They didn't. On the second day, rain turned to sleet. Rivers swelled. Mud swallowed their boots. Their food ran out. Yuri began coughing blood. Sandor sprained his ankle. Still, they pushed on, driven not by hope, but by desperation. When guards found them 3 days later, Yuri was dead, curled against a boulder with his eyes open to the sky. Victor and Sandor were alive but delirious, babbling nonsense. Their fingers were black with frostbite, their lips blue. They had traveled nearly 15 kilometers, a miracle in itself, but had collapsed within sight of a wolf pack. The wolves had been waiting. The guards dragged the surviving two back to camp and beat them publicly. Victor died in the punishment pit. Sandor survived, but he was never the same. His mind fractured, he muttered endlessly about rivers and mountains. He died the following winter, quietly and alone.
His last words were, "We almost touched freedom." The most famous escape attempt, however, belonged to a man named Arseny. He was no hero, no warrior, no mastermind. He had been a painter in Moscow, a quiet man who spent more time studying the way sunlight touched a wall than speaking to other people. When he was arrested for bourgeois decadence, he entered Kolyma like a man entering a nightmare. Yet something inside him refused to collapse. Arseny's plan was the strangest of all. He didn't try to outrun the guards. He didn't try to outsmart them. Instead, he befriended a cook, a guard, and even an urka. He moved quietly, listening to conversations, gathering information independently from each source. Piece by piece, he constructed a mental map of everything: guard schedules, supply routes, weak points, footpaths, distances between camps. He waited for 2 years. Then, during a supply run, while working on a transport crew, he simply stepped off the trail and disappeared behind a cluster of rocks. The guards noticed within minutes. They shouted. They fired rifles. But Arseny had vanished. For weeks the camp buzzed with rumors. Some claimed he had found an abandoned logging station and holed up with supplies. Others said a hunter had seen a strange man crossing the river toward the mountains. Some believed he had already died. Some believed he was still running. The truth came months later, when a reindeer herder delivered a body to the nearest village. It was Arseny, thin, frozen, curled beneath a tree as if painting something in the snow. He had traveled more than 70 kilometers, farther than anyone in recorded Kolyma history, far enough that it took days for guards to retrieve him. But he had not escaped, because no one escaped Kolyma. There were countless other stories, each one different, yet each identical in fate. Men who tried to swim across half-frozen rivers, men who attempted to steal sleds, men who disguised themselves as guards, men who crawled through drainage tunnels, men who climbed fences during storms, men who believed that freedom lay just beyond the next ridge.
None succeeded. It wasn't the guards. It wasn't the dogs. It wasn't the fences. It was the land.
Kolyma was a labyrinth forged by nature, a maze of ice, mountains, forests, and death. It stretched endlessly, with no landmarks to guide the lost. Snowstorms erased footprints within minutes. Frozen rivers cracked beneath weight. Wolves hunted relentlessly. Nights plunged into cold so deep that the stars themselves looked brittle. In that landscape, escape was not a route. It was a sentence. And yet, escape attempts continued, not because men believed they could win, but because the human spirit refuses to die quietly. A man named Oscar once said, "If I stay here, I will die. If I run, I will die. But if I run, I choose the moment." He ran. They found him 3 days later. Still, he chose. That choice mattered in a place where choice had been stolen from everyone. In the end, the escape attempts were not failures. They were acts of defiance, acts of hope, acts of remembrance that even in a frozen empire of suffering, men still possessed something the cold could not freeze. The desire, however small, however doomed, to breathe free air, even for a moment. Long before the world learned the name Kolyma, long before memoirs and testimonies scraped its truth into history, there existed another reality, one colder than the climate, quieter than the falling snow, and deadlier than any guard's bullet. It was the silence. The vast, suffocating silence that wrapped itself around the camps, the forests, the mines, and the men trapped within them. Silence was the camp's most loyal accomplice. It hid bodies that vanished beneath the snow. It smothered screams before they reached the barracks. It swallowed every trace of those who tried to escape. It preserved secrets under layers of permafrost, storing them like artifacts for some distant civilization to uncover. Silence in Kolyma was not mere absence of sound. It was a force, a presence. It ruled.
These whispers were dangerous. If a guard caught someone speaking too freely, punishment was swift and brutal. But the human need to be heard was stronger than fear. Even the most broken prisoner carried some small piece of truth he couldn't bear to let die. A group of prisoners in Barracks 11 kept a ritual. Every night, after roll call, after the guards had retreated to their warm huts, they gathered around the stove. The stove was weak, barely warm enough to heat their hands, but the glow was enough to cast shadows across their faces. They called it the circle of breath. Not because they spoke, they rarely dared, but because they listened. One prisoner would exhale slowly, letting his breath form a cloud in the cold air. Another would do the same, and another. Each breath meant, "I am here. I survived the day. I am still a voice in the darkness." It was silent communication, stories told without sound. But even silent defiance was defiance. The guards sensed something in Barracks 11. They began inspecting the men more harshly. They tore through bedding. They searched pockets. They demanded maims. They found nothing. The circle of breath continued. Then one night a guard saw it happen. The prisoners gathered, breathing together like a strange, living organism. He shouted for them to disperse. They scrambled. One man was beaten. Another was dragged outside for the night. But the ritual survived. Silence protected them and betrayed them. The second great crack in the silence came from a prisoner named Anatoly. He had once been a journalist, a man whose entire life had been built on words. In Kolyma, words were forbidden, but Anatoly carried them with him nonetheless. He carved them into wood scraps, scratched them into the dirt beneath his bunk, whispered them to the stars during night shifts. He wrote the truth of Kolyma in fragments, sentences stolen between moments of exhaustion, paragraphs hidden beneath planks of the barracks, journals wrapped in leather and buried near the fence line. He believed one thing fiercely: if I die here, my words must not. One winter night, during a storm so fierce that the wind sounded like a beast tearing at the sky, Anatoly pressed a bundle of notes into the hands of a sick prisoner named Yosef, a man he believed would soon be sent home due to illness.
"When you leave," Anatoly whispered, "carry these. Let the world know." Yosef promised. But Yosef never left. He died 2 days later. Guards burned his belongings. Anatoly watched in silent horror as months of his stolen writing turned to ash in the snow. He did not speak for days, not a word, not even when guards struck him. But silence did not break him. It hardened him. He began again, and this second time he was smarter. He hid his writings in the hollow leg of a stool, in the lining of a coat, beneath the floorboards. He taught other prisoners how to hide their stories too. For the first time, the silence of Kolyma began to rot from the inside. Yet the largest crack, one that shook even the guards, came from Kolyma itself. In late summer, a thaw revealed something in the road, something pale, something shaped like a skull. Workers found it while repairing a section of the highway. Korganov ordered the area cleared and the remains buried deeper, but rumors spread. Prisoners whispered of bones rising from the earth, of the land itself refusing to keep secrets. Then more bones appeared, frozen fingers jutting from mud, a rib cage cracked open by frost, a jawbone with teeth intact. The thaw had exposed a graveyard the size of a province. Even the guards grew uneasy. Kolyma was a beast that kept its dead close, but even beasts have limits. The land could not contain the weight of so many bodies. The silence, too, began to buckle under its own magnitude. Years passed. Prisoners died. Guards died. New faces replaced old ones, the mines expanded, the camps multiplied, but the silence endured, stretching, thinning, preparing for the day it would finally fracture. That fracture came slowly at first, small murmurs, hidden manuscripts, whispers traded between survivors. And then it came all at once, years later, when men who lived through Kolyma finally stepped outside its borders and told the world everything. But in the era of the camps, in the heart of the suffering, the silence was absolute. It was the snow that buried footprints. It was the cold that froze cries in men's throats. It was the state that erased records with a stroke of a pen. It was the guards who threatened death for a misplaced word. It was the fear that bound tongues and tightened every spine.
Kolyma was a kingdom of silence, a silence so vast it felt eternal, a silence that absorbed every story, every scream, every plea for mercy, a silence that lived on long after the last guard left, after the last prisoner died, after the last mine closed. The silence remained. And if one stands in the Kolyma Valley today, amid the ruins of barracks, the rusting machinery, the snow-covered road, they will hear it still, endless, heavy, echoing with memories the wind no longer dares to carry. For in Kolyma, even time fears to speak. For years, Kolyma felt eternal. The prisoners believed it, the guards believed it, even the mountains and forests seemed to believe it. The frozen empire was too vast, too remote, too brutal to ever crumble.
Men came and died, the camps expanded, the mines devoured more bodies, but nothing changed. Kolyma ruled with an iron stillness, a cold continuity that seemed older than the Soviet Union itself. And then, without warning, the first crack appeared, not in the permafrost, but in Moscow. In 1953, word traveled slowly across the empire. It crept through train stations, whispered through factories, slithered down alleyways, and seeped into labor camps like smoke through broken windows. Stalin was dead. The prisoners did not hear the news immediately. Radios in the camps were controlled, newspapers were censored, guards were ordered to maintain discipline. But silence, even in Kolyma, could not bury something so monumental. Rumors drifted from barracks to mines, from mines to road crews, carried by trembling voices. "He is gone." The guards seemed uneasy. They looked at the prisoners with something new in their eyes. Not fear, not sympathy, but uncertainty. For the first time, even they could not predict the future. Still, Kolyma did not soften overnight. The guards barked orders, the mines roared. The cold bit down harder than ever, but something intangible shifted in the air, as if the camp itself sensed that the force which had fueled its cruelty had begun to flicker. A month later, an announcement was read aloud during roll call.
"Review of sentences," the guard said, voice monotone. "Certain prisoners may qualify. Further directives to follow." He said it without emotion, but the camp erupted in whispers as soon as he stepped away. Review. Qualify. Directives. These words were foreign here. Hope was foreign here. But hope, once planted, grows quickly, even in frozen ground. Some men scoffed. They had lived too long in Kolyma to believe freedom could come from a sentence read aloud. But others, especially the newer prisoners, gripped those words tightly, as if they were lifelines. In the weeks that followed, a strange quiet fell upon the guards. They stopped certain punishments. They looked over their shoulders more often. They spoke to each other in hushed tones. Even Biryuk the jackal seemed to patrol less aggressively, though his eyes still burned with the same cruel vigilance. But the one who changed most was Commander Kurganov. Once unshakable, he now moved through the camp like a man haunted. He spent long hours in his office, studying documents, chain-smoking until the air turned blue. He snapped at guards for minor mistakes. He held meetings behind closed doors. Prisoners saw cracks in his composure, tiny tremors in the face of a man accustomed to control. And then the amnesties began. The first wave freed only a few, those convicted of minor crimes, those deemed rehabilitated, those whose sentences had been reviewed and approved by committees far from Siberia's edge. These few were escorted out of the gates, weak from starvation, blinking in disbelief as they walked into a world they thought they would never see again. One prisoner, an elderly schoolteacher named Roman, broke down sobbing the moment he stepped past the fence. He fell to his knees, clutching the frozen earth with shaking hands. "I thought I would die here," he whispered. The guards watched, uncomfortable. They did not know what to do with gratitude, with emotion, with humanity, suddenly presented before them. The amnesties continued. More names were read. More men left. Their fellow prisoners watched them go with a mixture of joy, envy, and fear. Joy
because someone had escaped the jaws of the cold. Envy, because freedom seemed arbitrary and cruelly distributed. Fear, because each released prisoner reminded those left behind how close they themselves had come and how far they still were. The Urkas, sensing the wind shifting against them, grew more violent. They stole more, beat more. A few attempted escapes, no longer content with their privileged position, but the guards cracked down swiftly. Even the criminals learned that change in Kolyma did not equal opportunity. As the months passed, the camp's operations began to falter. The mines still functioned, but production dropped. Too many workers had been freed or refused to work with their former obedience. Tools went missing. Equipment broke and was not repaired. Guards complained about shortages. Supplies arrived late, or not at all.
A sense of unraveling swept through the valley. One winter morning, a group of prisoners marched to the mine entrance, only to find the gates locked. No guards waiting, no overseers barking orders. They stood in the snow, confused, until a lieutenant emerged from the office building, reading from a document. "Mine operations suspended until further notice," he said. Suspended. The word echoed like a shot through the camp. No one dared cheer, but many exchanged glances filled with something they barely recognized anymore. Possibility. Still, Kolyma did not end peacefully. Nothing in Kolyma ever did. There were revolts, small ones, quickly crushed. One group of prisoners set fire to a storage shed. Another refused to work and was beaten mercilessly. A handful barricaded themselves inside a barracks. Guards stormed it and dragged them out half-conscious. But the momentum of collapse was too great to stop. The government in Moscow restructured the Gulag administration. Funding was slashed. Prisoner labor was deprioritized. Mines deemed unproductive were shut down. The guards received fewer rations. Morale plummeted. Then slowly the gates began to open. Thousands of prisoners, those who had survived long enough to see this moment, were handed documents, patched clothing, and meager supplies. They stumbled out into the world looking like ghosts released from captivity. Some returned home, if home still existed. Some wandered aimlessly, unable to reconcile freedom with the person they had become. Some wrote memoirs decades later. Others never spoke of Kolyma again. And some, unable to let go of the only world they understood, stayed near Magadan, living in broken huts, visiting the abandoned camps like mourners visiting a graveyard. But the fall of Kolyma was not a single moment. It was a slow death, stretched across years. Even as barracks emptied, other parts of the vast Kolyma network continued operating. One camp closed, another opened. The machinery of suffering did not halt immediately. It sputtered, flickered, and finally collapsed under its own weight. By the early 1960s, many of the worst camps were permanently shut down. The mines fell silent. The roads cracked and crumbled. The watchtowers stood empty, their wood rotting under layers of frost. Dogs were released or shot. Guard stations were abandoned. The wind became the sole inhabitant of structures once filled with cries and commands. Nature reclaimed the land. Nature reclaimed the land. Snow buried the barracks. Trees grew through collapsed roofs. Rivers erased footprints left by countless prisoners. The land swallowed its scars slowly, reluctantly, but inevitably. And yet,
Even in ruin, Kolyma did not lose its presence. The silence remained. The cold remained. The ghosts remained. Years later, visitors who ventured into the abandoned camps spoke of an eerie sensation, as though someone watched them from the corners of collapsing buildings, as though the wind carried whispers, as though the land itself remembered everything. But the truth was simpler, and far more tragic. Kolyma did not fall. It simply lost its guards. The cruelty that once thrived there seeped into memory instead of reality. And memory, like permafrost, preserves. In the end, the fall of the camp was not a triumph. It was not redemption. It was not justice. It was an ending. Nothing more, nothing less. An ending that left behind ruins, survivors, and a silence filled with stories the world had yet to hear. Long after the last guards abandoned their posts, long after the final prisoner staggered through the gates with a paper of release in trembling hands, long after the political winds shifted and the world pretended to forget, Kolyma remained. Not as a functioning camp, not as a city, not even as a ruin. Kolyma remained as memory, as legend, as a wound carved into the frozen skin of the earth. The land itself did not change. The mountains remained jagged and merciless, their peaks crowned in snow even in the warmest summers. The forests remained thin and cold, the trees forever whispering secrets in the wind. The rivers remained icy veins slicing through the valley, their waters dark and indifferent. The road of bones stretched on, cracked and overgrown in places, yet unmistakably present, like a scar that refuses to heal. But something else lingered too, something no one could see clearly, but everyone could feel. The ghosts.
Visitors who traveled to Kolyma decades after its fall often reported an unsettling silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of a place holding its breath. They described the sensation of being watched, not by animals or people, but by something woven into the landscape itself. Some said they heard footsteps behind them on empty roads. Others claimed to see shapes moving between trees, fleeting as breath on glass. It was easy to dismiss these accounts as imagination, but those who spent enough time in Kolyma understood the truth. The dead had not entirely left. Not in spirit, not in story, not in legacy. The barracks still stood in some places, their roofs collapsed, their wooden beams warped by frost and time. Snow drifted inside through broken windows. Footprints of animals crisscrossed the floors. Rusted bed frames clung to the corners like skeletal remains. Visitors who stepped inside felt a heaviness, as if the air itself remembered suffering. The mines were even more haunting. Their entrances gaped like open mouths, dark and endless, breathing out cold air that carried the metallic scent of forgotten labor. No one dared step inside. The tunnels were unstable, groaning under decades of shifting earth. But even standing near them, one could almost hear the faint echo of pickaxes striking stone, the hard breaths of exhausted men, the shouts of overseers long dead. Sometimes during the brief Kolyma summer, when the ground thawed enough to reveal what winter had hidden, bones resurfaced. A rib, a femur, a tooth. Fragments of lives that had been buried not in graves, but in roads and mud and ice. Scientists came to collect them, documenting, cataloging. But for every bone discovered, thousands remained concealed beneath the permafrost. Time in Kolyma moved differently. Slowly, reluctantly. As if even the passage of years feared disturbing what lay beneath. But the ghosts were not only physical remains.
They lived in the stories of survivors, men and women who had escaped Kolyma's grasp but never shed its imprint. They carried it inside them wherever they went, in their silence, in their nightmares, in the way they flinched at sudden noises or scanned rooms for exits. One survivor, a man named Victor, returned to Kolyma in his old age. His hair was white, his hands arthritic, but his eyes still held the cautious alertness of a prisoner too long hunted. He walked through the remains of his former camp, stepping carefully over debris. He found the barracks where he once slept. He found the mine entrance where he lost friends. He found the tree line where he had buried scraps of stolen bread for starving comrades. And when he reached the road of bones, he stopped. The wind blew gently that day. Snowflakes drifted softly, though it was midsummer. Victor knelt and pressed his palm to the frozen ground.
"I'm still here," he whispered. "I didn't forget." The wind answered with a low moan. Some might have called it coincidence. Victor did not. He bowed his head, letting tears fall into the dry, cracked earth. He was not alone. Every year others returned, children of prisoners, grandchildren, historians, researchers, wanderers drawn by a haunting curiosity. They walked the same paths prisoners once marched. They touched the icy water of the same rivers. They listened for echoes carried by the wind. Many left flowers, some left letters, others left stones, small markers of remembrance. One woman, whose mother had died in Kolyma before she was born, left a tiny wooden toy on the steps of a collapsed barracks. "For the childhood you never had," she whispered. The toy remained for months before disappearing beneath the snow. Kolyma accepted these offerings silently. But not all ghosts were mournful. Some were angry. There were stories, told quietly, cautiously, of travelers feeling sudden dread near certain parts of the valley, of hearing footsteps behind them when no one was there, of seeing a figure standing motionless in the distance, wrapped in frost, dissolving when approached, of voices carried on the wind, whispers and languages long dead, cries for help, murmured prayers. Some insisted Kolyma was cursed. Others insisted it was sacred. Both were wrong. Kolyma was something older, rawer, a repository of suffering so vast that the land itself had become an archive, every tree ring, every sediment layer, every gust of wind recording what the world tried so hard to forget. Those who listened carefully understood that the ghosts were not trapped. They were not seeking revenge. They were reminders. They existed to ensure that the silence which once protected cruelty would never return. The Soviet Union had tried to bury Kolyma, to erase it, to pretend it had been necessary. Revisionists softened its story, politicians looked the other way, but the ghosts remained vigilant. They lingered in the cracks of abandoned buildings, in the frost-covered ground, in the memories of survivors.
Because forgetting was the greatest danger of all. If Kolyma were forgotten, then the cruelty that built it could return in another form, under another name, in another corner of the world. The ghosts whispered so that the living would remember. And remember they did. Books appeared, memoirs, poems, films. Historians unearthed old records. Survivors spoke publicly, their voices shaking but unbroken. Schools taught new generations about the price of oppression. Museums displayed artifacts pulled from the mines and barracks. Slowly, painfully, the silence cracked. Kolyma became a symbol, not just of suffering, but of resilience. A warning carved into frozen earth. A testament to what human beings can endure and to the evil systems they must resist. And the ghosts? They watched. They watched as the world finally spoke their names. They watched as people walked the road of bones with candlelight instead of chains. They watched as the silence they once lived under finally shattered. Even today, if one stands on a ridge overlooking the valley at dusk, when the sky glows purple and the first cold breath of night creeps across the land, one might feel something brush past. A chill that has nothing to do with wind, a presence that lingers just long enough to be felt. It is not malevolent. It is not seeking fear. It is memory. A reminder. A whisper carried through time. We were here. We suffered. We mattered. Do not forget us. And the snow-covered valley, quiet and vast, listens. For in Kolyma, the cold may fade, the buildings may fall, the road may crumble, but the ghosts remain, watching, waiting, remembering, always.